Greetings, and now we are into Chapter 11, Families and Married Relationships. We're looking at, like the book's definition of families, where people live together in commitment, form an economic unit, and care for any young, consider their identity to be significantly attached to the group. Sexual expression and parent-child relationships are part of most, but not all, family relationships. So fairly wide sort of definition that we have working there. They quickly go to the concept of kinship. Now, there's a good test question. Would kinship include adoption? Since often, for instance, in the South, we often think of kinship to be blood ties, but actually, again, kinship does include adoption. So we have family of orientation, family of procreation. Orientation, where you came from. Family of procreation, that's the family that you make. We have the extended family and the nuclear family. Now, this is probably one of those key parts about why it is at times Westerners, particularly Americans, often have conflict of simple worldview about why this chapter is so important, because almost everywhere else in the world, when you say family, you're talking about an extended group of people. You're talking about, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents. Where here, when we talk about family in the United States, we're almost always exclusively talking about the nuclear family, mom, dad, 2.5 kids. So right away, you can start seeing that as we form policy, like family planning and stuff like that, as we talk about world interaction, world policies, that will often be at odds with other people's cultures and countries, because they think of family to include people, again, cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents. So the next discussion is the concept of marriage. Another good book definition here. Legally recognized or socially approved arrangement between two or more individuals that carry certain rights and obligation and usually involve sexual activity. So they begin discussion of monogamy. For a lot of us, we feel that this is somehow the natural way of things, but I got to tell you, monogamy, as we experience it, really only about 150 years old, maybe 200, where monogamy is expected of both the male and the female partner. We can see that throughout most of human history, we've practiced polygamy, where there's more than one spouse. Usually, this is polygyny, where one man has several wives, or what's called the harem model. There's also polyandry, where one woman is able to have multiple husbands. We find that generally in areas where you get isolated population, where the idea of making more group members is more important than an individual's sort of claim on a romance or relationship. We talked about patrilineal and matrilineal descent. This is where we track our identity through either mom or dad. We practice patrilineal descent. As a Marxist, I must point out that that's because we're concerned about that because of who has property. The male has property, so we have this elaborate set of sexual restriction and control on women. So whoever my child is, I can feel pretty good that they actually are mine because of this very restrictive social arrangement, because we're going to track descent through dad, even though we haven't had this DNA test thing for more than about 15, 20 years. How we do it for the rest of time, it was, again, through this very elaborate social mechanism, which we try to control women and limit their contact with other males, when in fact, actually, it makes more sense to do it matrilineally, considering I I don't necessarily know for sure that I'm the father of that child, but definitely that's that child's mother. Again, popped right out of her. So we would be able to see that. Why is this, again, such a issue? We find this being an issue because of inheritance and property. We also are going to get a new term called cuckold, Cuckold. This term, not in your book, this term is where somebody is fooled into raising a child that they think is theirs, but in fact is not. Now, people say, oh, well, how often could this possibly happen? Some interesting research from a hospital in St. Louis. They did a year's worth of tracking down birth certificate information and using blood type, and found out 19% of the children's father listed on the birth certificate could not have been the father, based strictly on blood type. They weren't even doing DNA back then. So what's the deal there? How do we do that? Well, we follow a line of, again, higher primates. No higher primate is monogamous. Most higher primates practice the harem polygyny model. Oddly enough, interesting group, the pygmy chimpanzee, or the bonobo, actually has a female-run hierarchy, and sex is not restricted. In fact, sex is used as a way just to make amends, make group members feel better if somebody feels upset about something. There isn't a restrictive sexual focus. And in fact, there's no whose child is it mine, because one of the ugly things that we don't talk about with, chimpanzees, because, oh, wow, they're so cute. We train them to, ride bicycles and wear clothes and drink a beer or smoke a cigar. In real life, chimpanzees, baboons often practice what's called infanticide. When a new male takes over a troop of females, he kills all of the infant children to make sure that the next group of children are for sure his. Terrible for us. We look at that and think that's awful. On the other hand, it seems to be selected for in genetics, because then all the females are considered receptive and go into heat. Endogamy, exogamy, marrying within our group, exogamy, marrying without our group. This is, again, one of those things where we hear things like, oh, well, opposites attract. And they absolutely do. But what do we know about relationships? The more opposite you are, the more difficult that you have trying to see the world the same and keeping a relationship going. So, functionalist theory, 4 elements that they're looking at there about what function the family serves. Sexual regulation, socialization, economic and psychological support, provision of social status. Again, we learned where we fit into society, where our family's class position was, all based on our family unit. The conflict theory says that, in fact, actually, the family is a microcosm of the exploitation that we see in the workplace. The worker is exploited at the workplace. He comes home and exploits the female's labor in the household to create a free labor force for caring for the family. The symbolic interactions perspective is interesting. Again, following Cooley and Mead, here we find out what we call the his and her marriage. Now, I can say, as doing some marriage counseling in the other aspect of my job, I can say I find this a lot, the his and her marriage, where the partners view marriage completely differently based on their viewpoint of, again, you hear often guys will talk about sort of minimum expectation, hey, well, I think things are good in the marriage, we got the bills paid and, we're getting along okay. And often the female partner will be like, no, I'm looking for my soulmate, and, he's not growing with me, and he's crushing my soul and things like that. And that actually does happen, where the expectations of marriage are completely different. Next, we talk about love and intimacy. As I said, no matter what's said, about 80-90% of you are going to go get married. And, shortly after that, you might want to think about this whole having sex thing. And, we think of ourselves as a very sexually liberated group of folks in the modern era, but we actually hold a lot of owing a lot to a guy named Alfred Kinsey and his group, who actually looked into sexual expectations and norms, did a lot of interviewing, and faced a lot of pushback. A lot of people were very upset with Kinsey and thought, oh, he's this crazy, sex-crazed guy. But we learned a lot of stuff from Kinsey about female sexuality. We learned, actually, women like sex. Wow, shocking idea. This is back in the 1950s. And we learned things, from his work like, hey, there's something called foreplay. And there's also some things that were amiss with his research. He did some of his research in places like prisons. So he reported 1 in 10 people have homosexual experiences in their lifetime. We're not so comfortable with those numbers now. We probably think that the folks that are more exclusively homosexual, about 4.5% of the population, not 10% or 1 in 10. But still, very valuable research that he did back in the day. And we'll go on to part 2.